Ever since it was first created, Kotlin has really thrived on server-side use cases. And really, that shouldn't come as much of a surprise because the JVM is a great platform for that. And it has a super established ecosystem that's been powering everything from like startups to like large enterprises alike. So today I'm very excited because we're sitting down with Rod Johnson, who's the creator of Spring, the founder of Spring Source, author, investor, and developer. We're going to talk about Kotlin. We're going to talk about Spring and we're going to talk about server-side applications in general. This is Talking Kotlin. I'm your host, Sebastian, and I'm joined by my lovely co-host, Márton.
Hi, Rod. Welcome to the show.
Hi, nice to meet you guys.
So, most people probably know you as the founder and creator of Spring. So perhaps we should start the story there about how that came along and what exactly that looked like at the time.
Spring came out of an itch that I had myself. And, I think a lot of things that are successful in software really come from having lived the pain. So one of the things I think that worked really well with Spring is all the initial developers of Spring, in fact, even many of the developers to this day, came out of enterprise application development. So if you wind the clock back to the early 2000s, there were a bunch of people at Sun who were dreaming up wonderful specs who had actually never worked in the kind of companies in, say, London or New York that were building applications using that technology. We were different. We came out of that space. We came out of consulting, banking, the kind of organizations that were doing complex things with enterprise Java. So Spring it had a somewhat odd genesis in that many of the core ideas, such as what was later called dependency injection, I developed working in London in 99, 2000. And then I wrote a book in which I advanced these ideas and thought the code embodying these ideas would be a useful illustration. After that, I was approached by people who'd bought the book, wanting to know what is the license for this code? Can we use it in real apps? And by the way, can we help make it better? So, the open source project really came out of the book.
That's an incredible origin story. But I have to say, it's probably. I mean, I'd suppose like going from picking out the good parts of maybe like an architecture or what you would imagine a framework to be like, and then going from there and like turning it into like an actual like maintained framework that is ready for other people to use. I assume that's still a pretty big step, right?
Yes, it's an enormous step. So I think coming out of a book was more beneficial than I realized at the time, because it meant that everybody was on the same page. There were no disputes about architectural style. In fact, one of the things that is true today is that Spring is astonishingly consistent. Like if you know how one part of Spring works, you know how other parts of Spring work. So it kept everyone, well, almost literally not on the same page, but on one of the same 750 pages. And it really helped, I think, with quality. So getting it to be the dominant framework that it became required a mixture of really hard work, some good luck, and also, frankly, I think the fact that it turned out that I actually really was very interested in business as well as technology. I think that was very important. But certainly I think it goes without saying that there is no globally successful open source project that didn't involve an enormous amount of hard work and work from people even before they really thought they were going to make any money out of it. So, there were people like myself, Jürgen Herrler, Colin Sampliano, Keith Donald, in the early days who were putting in a ton of work without there really being any clear payoff. So let's get beyond that. I think there was a degree of luck in the quality of the people. So, for example, Jürgen Hurler is an astonishing developer. So, the fact that I founded this thing and the first person who came and contributed a significant amount of code is like, you know, deservedly now a legendary developer. There was probably a degree of luck in that. I think the community played a really important role. And there, I do think, honestly, we can, as a founding team, take some credit for it. This was in the days before anybody bothered with codes of conduct or anything like that. I think we didn't actually need that. We were just decent people. We did not tolerate any bad behavior in the community. We genuinely wanted to help people, be respectful, do our best to answer questions. And I think that meant that as the team grew, it continued to be a professional, respectful, well behaved team. And also, I think people in the community really appreciated it. So, one of the delightful things in the first, probably even in the first few months, was you would see people jumping in from the community answering questions. So the first wave of questions were answered by me, Jürgen, Ben, Alex, Colin, these people who were core developers, but quite quickly you got people who were obviously smart, developers who knew their stuff, who were grateful for the fact that they'd gotten help and wanted to help others as well. But, I think with open source, it is absolutely vital to have a strong economic model. I do think open source is a good thing, but I'm a very long way from Richard Stallman's views on open source. I felt and articulated very, very early, like probably 2004, 2005, there had to be a viable business model behind Spring, because this was far too ambitious and far too complex to be sustained purely by volunteer developers. And also, we were very proud of the fact that we felt we really were innovating. We weren't just, if you look at the early to mid 2000s, there were two really important players in the Java open source market. There was JBoss and there was Spring, and they had a head start on us. Essentially, and I've probably said a few controversial things about JBoss in my time, but I don't think this one's even controversial. JBoss was not innovative. In fact, there was no metric you could possibly come up with that wouldn't say that if you could afford WebLogic, you would use WebLogic instead of JBoss, because it was just better. JBoss was important because it meant you didn't have to buy an expensive app server, but it was essentially commoditization in open source. Spring was not like that. Spring gave you something that you couldn't get from BA, Oracle, Sun, or IBM. And in order to do that, you do need to have a solid economic model.
I love this explanation, because I feel like there's so many like different parts we can dive into. First of all, on the part of consistency across like the Spring framework, I personally find this extremely impressive. It's one of those feats that makes it possible to learn something that feels naturally very complex, and something that just has like a lot of moving parts. But if the mental model that underpins it is like consistent, you can make assumptions that hold like across different bits and pieces, which is always very nice. I very much hope that we'll be able to talk a little bit about Kotlin later on as well. But I mean, it's one of the reasons why I definitely fell in love with some of the Kotlin stuff as well, because I always describe it as like you have a whole bunch of pieces and they kind of click together like Lego pieces. It's like you kind of see where things fit together, and like there's a somewhat consistent philosophy that goes on. So hopefully we can draw some parallels uh, there as well. But I'm curious if you wanted to expand a little bit more on this idea of doing sustainable development in this open source context.
The whole open source business question is very, very broad. And certainly there are some things that volunteer open source works well for. but they are not things like Spring. Something that's that extensive also has integrations with so many things. So, fairly early on, we were dealing with the fact that when it was still massively popular, IBM used to play a game with every major release of WebSphere called Let's Put the Transaction Manager Somewhere You Can't Find It. And there were also bugs in different products, things that had performance implications that you really needed to respond to quickly, particularly in those integrations. And that's the kind of thing that you can't rely on volunteer open source for. I would guarantee that for every one of those versions of WebSphere in the 2000s, Jurgen just so rapidly ensured that Spring worked perfectly with that version of WebSphere because that was essentially Jurgen's job. Had Jurgen been as good as he is, there's no guarantee that would have got to the top of his to-do list had he not been full-time working on Spring. I do think that, to be perfectly honest, I'm slightly depressed about the state of open source. There appeared to be a period of time when open source was establishing itself as a business category. And while I may have had differences with some of the people and the technology, I think JBoss played a really important role there because they showed that you could have a different model that made things more accessible to companies and individuals who didn't have that much money. And there was a period, probably until maybe the early 2010s, when it seemed inevitable that some of these open source acquisitions, like, for example, SpringSource, MySQL, JBoss, were getting fairly large, and that this was becoming a powerful thing from a business perspective. I think, unfortunately, the move towards the cloud has been quite problematic in that respect. So I believe that sustainable open source is really good for just about everybody. I believe that it is not good if open source developers can't hope to create wealth. So, for example, if the best I could have hoped for was getting a well-paid job at IBM or, say, AWS, if it had existed at the time, I would not have been particularly motivated because, obviously I could have got a well-paid job with any bank or, so, I do think that in terms of some of the incredibly hard things you need to do to build communities, some degree, and I'm not talking purely about a financial incentive, I'm talking about the excitement of building an organization, building a business, something that isn't just purely about dollars and cents. So, because you look at, say, for example, Shai Banon at Elastic, because I was an early investor in Elastic, was on the board for years. Like me, he is not motivated by being an employee, even if he's well appreciated and well compensated. He wants to create something and make a difference and have more say in doing that. Anyway, I've digressed a lot there, but I feel a little concerned that I think there's actually potentially more value being captured by incumbents now than there was in that lovely period from the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s.
So I really think that with open source projects, we see this a lot, that it really requires the outsized efforts of very passionate individuals to drive things, and then eventually it becomes very important to, in fact, make it sustainable, as you said, and to have some kind of monetization model. And as we were listening to the story, I felt like there are a lot of parallels to draw with some of the things that JetBrains has been doing with both products, like an IntelliJ, where you said those integrations with all of the popular frameworks and other services were very valuable. I think IntelliJ is one of the big drivers is actually the Spring integration in Ultimate, right? So making sure that you are connecting with the things that people are using. And then the story that Spring came from, this group of people who worked on actual applications in comparison to people who who kind of just came up with frameworks for the sake of it, or from like a very different experience. So that connects with how Kotlin was born, right? Because that was also born in the industry, so it wasn't an academic effort, but it was developed because the developers within JetBrains wanted to use it for their actual products. And I think that's probably a good transition to talk a bit about Kotlin, as in, I think the purpose for this podcast, or the like initial idea for it, came about because we saw that you are using Kotlin more and more, and you were posting quite happily about your experience. I mean, what has that been like? How did you get started using Kotlin?
So I actually spent a very, very long time away from Java and Spring. So I guess by the time of the acquisition of Spring Source in 2009, I had been purely focused on business things for probably a couple of years. And probably for the next 2 or 3 years after that, I didn't write very much code at all. Then I actually really got into Scala. And later, for reasons of various projects I was working on, I did a lot of TypeScript and quite a bit of Python. And I finally got sick of Python about this time last year and decided that for what I was building, which is a fairly complex application, Python is just not well suited to serious software engineering. So I thought, okay, I'm going to switch to Java and Spring AI. So at that point, I obviously knew Kotlin was out there, and given that I already knew Scala, it would be natural to look at it. But I made a very deliberate effort to bring myself up to date with modern Java. Given that the last Java I'd written was probably Java 7, I thought that it's important that before I look at anything else, I'm thoroughly familiar with Java. And indeed, Java has improved a lot. But I eventually got sick of lifting to and from streams, which I do think, frankly, is embarrassing. Like, there are many good things about modern Java, but that is embarrassing compared to other platforms. And I think that strictly speaking, I think I had been looking at some particularly horrible collection code, and I was walking the dog to the dog park. And by the time I got back from the dog park, I decided, okay, better try Kotlin. It's got to be better than this. And I would say I found the learning curve exceptionally easy. And I have now, I would say, probably within 2 months of starting Kotlin, maybe less, maybe it was more like 4 weeks, I basically had no desire to write Java at all. So, like, all the code I write is now Kotlin. And having said that, I'm never going to be a Java hater. In fact, I do think that, when you look at present Java, it's a lot better than it gets credit for. And if that's the only choice you have, I think, the JVM and Spring is still a damn good alternative, say, to Node. Um, However, if you have the opportunity to use Kotlin, I really think it'd be pretty hard to go past that, because I mean it's just nicer, it's more readable, it's more fun to write, it's just a more modern language. Obviously, I did feel the same thing about Scala for my personal projects, but I think even at the height of my enthusiasm for Scala, I could absolutely see myself as a manager having projects where I wouldn't want people using Scala, because we know what happens when you have large projects where people use Scala. With Kotlin, it doesn't feel like that. I mean, I would say the one thing that I'm not totally sold on is extension functions. So they're definitely better than some of the things in Scala. But like, by and large, everything that's in Kotlin, I think it comes back to what you said about it coming out of the practitioner space rather than academia. Everything feels like it's there for a reason, and it's not there for reasons of academic, fashion. I think also one thing that's important to note when we consider the genesis of both Spring and Kotlin is that although they have solved problems that the previous technology failed at, they benefited from it. So, for example, EJB, I think it's pretty well known that I'm not a fan of EJB. Nevertheless, we learned a lot from what worked and what didn't work with EJB. I mean, like, we basically took the transaction model from EJB and just made it better. So, there was that experience that was really valuable. Similarly, if you look at Kotlin today, I think the experience from Scala, I mean, there's obviously things from Scala that you see in Kotlin. And I think that was a real benefit to have, seen what was possible and then say, okay, maybe we can do this in a more practical way.
Yeah. I have to say there is an excellent talk which I think is titled like Building on the Shoulders of Giants or something very close to that, which where Andrei Breslov talks about how Kotlin built on top of things like Scala, things we learned there, and how it also lifted a lot of the puzzle pieces that Seb mentioned earlier, which I think you confirmed also fit together very nicely. So how all of those pieces were lifted from various different languages, including Python, for example, for some features.
That is, the thing that I have found, if there's a single thing that I've found, well, there's two things that I've found surprising about using Kotlin. One is that I like it as much as I do. Like, I thought I would like it, but I really, really like it. So that's been a positive surprise. The other thing is that my Kotlin actually looks quite like Python. And it's funny that I've written a lot of Python because I've been doing AI stuff. And I, by and large, do not like Python as a language. Yet in Kotlin, I discover my code actually looks quite like Python. And it has everything that I liked about Python and nothing that I didn't like. Like, for example, it's got the clarity and readability of Python, which is a real thing. But it's got a better type system. It gives me the ability to use Spring. It gives me the ability to run on the JVM. There's just many things that I like better.
Yeah, it's so great to hear this kind of entry into Kotlin's story again. By the way, because we talk a lot with people who have been writing Kotlin for some years, and we talk about things like Kotlin multi-platform. But I think it's great to remember the original platform and the original JVM focus of Kotlin, and also just to go back to the time when each of us first encountered Kotlin, because I think we all very much had the same experience. At least I'm reliving the experience through your story here that I initially had many years ago, where it fits together so nicely, it interoperates so well, and the more Kotlin I write, the happier I am about it. And I think that many of our listeners probably had a very similar experience when they first got hooked on working with Kotlin.
There is also really not a lot of learning curve. I mean, obviously, I know a lot of programming languages, and I've been, a professional developer for almost 30 years. So obviously, it's probably easier for me than a lot of people to learn a new language. But on the other hand, Kotlin is pretty painless. It doesn't seem to have a lot of gotchas where you'll start doing things that. And secondly, I think if well, on the JVM, obviously you would be coming from Java, but if you know one at least of Python or Scala, I think it's going to be very easy. Um, Not to mention the fact that we now have an absolutely fabulous resource for learning languages, which is LLMs. So basically, ChatGPT helped me learn Python at a far faster rate than I otherwise would. And it's definitely helped as well with Kotlin. One fascinating thing, and I'd be very curious as to your experience on this, because I'm sure you've seen it. One thing that surprised me at first is, given that since LLMs have been part of my working day, I've been working in three languages: Python, Java, Java 22, and Kotlin. The quality of the completions for Kotlin is far higher than with either Python or Java, which sounds weird because these are like the two biggest languages on the planet. And of course, it makes sense when you think about it, because both Python and Java have been around forever. And best practices have changed a lot very recently, right? If you're writing Python, you should be using type hints. You should be using a lot of things that are just way nicer, say in 3.10 or whenever it is and above. You shouldn't be writing the Python that a lot of people would have written 4 years ago. And the same with Java, right? You should absolutely be using records. There's various things you should, that 98% of the Java code on the planet is not the kind of code you should be writing. With Kotlin, obviously, that's not the case. And I also imagine it's partly that because Kotlin has attracted early adopters, a lot of the code quality that's out there is probably written by people who are good. That was initially quite a surprise to me. But I mean, I've found with both those other languages, it is a really clear difference. I seldom get bad Kotlin code suggested, whereas I so often, despite my efforts to change prompts and the like, I just get, Java I would never write anymore.
I mean, I think from our perspective, we're also, I mean, we're super excited about always hearing these kind of points, and you're certainly not the first person to mention this to us. But yeah, I think there's just an internal, maybe just an internal consistency in the language that maybe also just helps the LLMs work. We're of course also at JetBrains trying to, like, if you're looking at like the AI assistant things that we're doing, there's a lot of like the in IDE models are specifically like fine tuned for Kotlin code specifically as well. Which, I mean, if you have all the knowledge about how things are supposed to look like, I suppose that may also help a little bit um, with the overall setup. Um, yeah, but generally, I think the Kotlin has stayed a pretty consistent course. If you go back like maybe 3 or 5 years, your Kotlin code may have looked a little bit different, but a lot of the core principles are still applied. I'm very curious. I haven't tried this particular part, but I'm curious if, for example, your Chat GPT or your other LLMs already suggest some of the features that are quote unquote more modern in Kotlin, like functional interfaces or context receivers. I guess are still experimental, so I hope they don't push them too much. Um, but these kind of things, I'm curious. Have you like seen it make use of the entirety of the language that's available?
Generally, the qualities seem pretty good. I can't recall whether or not it suggested using functional interfaces. But yeah, generally it seems idiomatic. Like it looks like the kind of Kotlin that you would write using things like, say, let that don't exist in Java. Elvis operator, those, like it, yeah, it definitely looks, well, I guess that's been around forever, but
This is one of the things that personally I'm actually, now that you mentioned this, especially scope functions in Kotlin, right? That's something that's you kind of need to get used to a little bit. Let apply, like, also run, all of these things, right? Um, I was very surprised as to, like, taking a snippet that kind of looked Java-esque, where people were just, doing a couple of null checks. Maybe they were already using like the smart casting features that are available for Kotlin, but they were still just, stacking some null checks, just asking an LLM and being like, "Hey, like, what's a nicer way to write this?" And it turning this into, like, a like Elvis operator with like an early return, and like actually making use of the fact that the language does make inferences about nullability based on like the individual return paths and all this thing. That did kind of blow my mind as well. I'll have to be honest.
Yeah. No, I definitely, I would say most of the suggestions are idiomatic. I generally, for if I'm like discussing code in LLM, I generally use Claude, because I think Claude actually does significantly better in terms of ongoing conversations, around, at least around code. But yes, generally it seemed to be idiomatic. I think one of the really nice things about Kotlin is you can start without great pain. There are languages that you cannot start without great pain. So, for example, C, or C++. In fact, I would argue that one of the reasons Java has been so successful is Java was a language you could start without great pain. It was pretty hard to write code that would, be painful and cause you horrible problems that were not obvious. So, I would absolutely say with developers coming to Kotlin that they should probably just chill. And you know what? If at first they write Kotlin that is not using a tremendous amount of stuff they couldn't do in Java, that's fine. It's not like it's not the code they're probably going to be writing in a year, and they're probably going to come back and change it, but it's not going to do anything terrible. So, I do think it's a non-scary adoption path. And also, readability is hard to judge because it's so subjective. But I would say, on the whole, that I haven't seen a lot of Kotlin that I find hard to read. Whereas, obviously, with Scala, that was a problem, right? Like people had their own idioms in Scala. Also, unfortunately, the Scala community was overrun by people who were functional zealots and were determined that everything had to be pure. And it seems to me that not only is Kotlin a pretty readable language, but it doesn't seem to be the kind of language that attracts those kind of people.
Yeah, I think people are tend to be very pragmatic in the Kotlin like universe. I'm I want to pick up on the point of saying like, hey, like that, yeah, you can pretty much just start writing Kotlin code like now, and probably after a year or so, when you embrace the idioms of Kotlin, your code will look different. I totally agree. First of all, it was one of my favorite bits of like my personal Kotlin learning journey when I first got started was writing like I'll be like, well, I don't know how I would write this, and then like you just you'd write the same way you did it in Java, and maybe you get like an inspection in the IDE telling you like, hey, there's a nicer way of doing this, and you kind of like you pick up things here and there, and you kind of begin to like converge on what looks like more idiomatic code. Now, you did make a comment a couple minutes back that I can't just let skip. Um, which is you mentioned you're not yet really sold on the concept of extension functions in Kotlin, and I feel like this is worth discussing a little bit more. I'd really like to hear where that's coming from, because when we talk to a lot of people, or when we like ask people on whatever short form social media site is currently still alive, um, a lot of people mention extension functions as like one of the first things that they fell in love with Kotlin. So I'm curious, what's the story here?
So I guess I can see why they're very valuable in terms of frameworks. And, Kotlin, one of the wonderful things about Kotlin, I think, is that whereas the Scala community tried to reinvent every wheel they could possibly find on the JVM, the Kotlin community has embraced existing things. So I totally get that it's really nice to be able to write object mapper.register Kotlin module, right? That just makes a lot of existing Java things really nice to consume. I guess I am making minimal use of it in my own code. So I guess I'm benefiting from it when I use it with things like Jackson. But I don't know. I'm just skeptical about whether it's necessary to me. It's just a little bit magical. And also, frankly, one of the things I liked about going from C++ to Java is in C++, you had to hunt for all the places where your class was defined, because the source code could be practically anywhere. Whereas in Java, it was like, it's opinionated, it's here. So, yeah, I've found, I do like, however, the fact that you have to import the extension. That I think that definitely scopes it. But yeah, to be honest, I haven't really. There's been a few times actually where I think it's been an LLM that suggested using an extension function for something. And there's maybe one or two that I've kept, but I'm often like skeptical about I don't see. So yeah, frankly, to me, unless I'm missing something massive, I think it is a really, really good integration feature to get the most out of Java libraries. But personally, I don't feel a need to use it.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like again, this is the beauty about Kotlin is like you can kind of pick and choose even the language features that you use in your own application code. I think this has been ever since the inception of Kotlin. Uh, it's been the classic, like the hype cycle, I kind of want to say, where when a new language feature comes out, or as a team starts adopting Kotlin and learning about a new language feature, they go all in on it, and they really, they maybe over embrace it. All of a sudden, everything's an extension function, or all of a sudden, everything is like a top level function that gets injected somehow. And then, as you kind of learn what that means for like your own like maintenance burden, or whether you what that means for like the readability of your code, like people like find an equilibrium that they're comfortable with, right?
Yeah, I would say overall, my Kotlin, I think, is now pretty idiomatic. So I'm certainly no longer. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't look. It looks nothing like Java. But yeah,
I have absolutely seen the same thing, by the way, when teams are adopting Kotlin for the first time, that they start off writing Java, they overshoot, and then they have to like course correct on using just 12 levels of nested scope functions and all
yeah,
all
yeah,
kinds of magic they've managed to
yeah.
cram in there.
There are some actually. I have. Maybe I shouldn't admit this, but I haven't really looked at a great deal at the language roadmap or how we got here. I'm just using the current version. And I kind of, to be honest, I like the fact that I don't need to do that. Just what I want makes sense. There are, however, a couple of things that I still do miss. But coming from like, I would say, as of now, I'm probably in a tie as to my favorite language between Kotlin and TypeScript. I am choosing to use Kotlin because Kotlin plus Spring is I would probably pick Java plus Spring over TypeScript plus Node. So I mean, if I've got a language that's equally good, it's just not even close. But there are certain things I miss, like I miss union types. I miss type algebra. And I know there can be a tendency to go a little crazy with some of those things. But, things like union types and partials are just really, really useful. And those are probably, yeah. The other thing is object literals are just nasty in Kotlin. That's probably the only Kotlin syntax I look at and think, seriously? Like everything else about Kotlin looks syntactically nice.
The fact that you don't have to deal a lot with versioning in Kotlin is quite nice to hear. I assume you've already landed on like a Kotlin 2.0 to begin with. Not that we had a large breaking change, but given that you started recently, I assume that you're somewhere beyond 2.0. And really a lot of the foundational things that we've mentioned, like extensions and scope functions and all of the like basic syntax, of course, has been there for from the beginning for many years, which is why I suppose LLMs would also be able to cover that quite well.
Yeah, I just checked.
But
I'm
at
on
this,
2.0.21. So
Nice.
yeah.
you are very up to date. Excellent.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, Kotlin has been like slowly evolving. Like there were language features that were not there in the beginning that we take for granted as well. So it's a very interesting mix of very strong foundations, but also like continuous steps forward. And it was, it was step by step. It was one feature here, one feature there, but overall it adds up to quite a bit of evolution. And of course, now that we've been past 2.0 and we have the new K2 compiler, we will probably see language evolution speed up a little bit because we have been waiting for the new compiler so that we can move ahead with some features without having to implement them.
I mean, it obviously is far less painful from a language version standpoint than Scala was. I mean, that was obviously a massive problem with, and continues to be a massive problem with Scala usage. That just things kept getting broken. I mean, there's one other thing that I should say, which is I've always believed that people over-index on languages and that ecosystems are just incredibly important. So, if you look at Kotlin, its integration with the Java world is extraordinary. And it's so different from like when you were working with Scala. I mean, Scala it's possible to take any code that's written in Java and write it in Scala and it'll look nicer. It's also possible that somebody else will write it in Scala that nobody except them will understand and will actually be proud about it. But the interop, if you are working in an environment where you're using Java libraries, where you need to interop with Java code, it's very painful. And quickly you find that you're devoting a lot of your time to that. The interop pain in Kotlin is so close to zero. It's truly remarkable. And I guess that I mentioned, some of the surprises I had. I'd obviously been occasionally reading things over the years, so I knew that Kotlin interop was good. But I must say, I probably spent my first 2 or 3 weeks in Kotlin thinking, well, something bad has to happen soon. It's going too smoothly. I'm going to get a nasty surprise with the integration with all the Java code that's being used, and I have not got the nasty surprise.
Yeah, there's really nothing like actually trying it in practice and then seeing it work.
Yeah,
No,
and
that's
again, I haven't really looked into how it works under the covers, but I would imagine that again, there's the benefit from having seen the experience with Scala, right? And how can we, for example, have nice collection libraries that don't have pain? Yeah.
By the way, so I think your the criticisms that you have when you said like, yeah, you were working a lot with Kotlin and with TypeScript, and that there's a couple of things missing, especially in the type system. Personally, I would agree. I think generally this also like applies, and our language design teams are also kind of looking at this. So if for you, and of course for all of our listeners who are interested, there's a great talk by Ross Tate, which is called "Revamping and Extending Kotlin's Type System," which is from this year's KotlinConf, or well, KotlinConf 2024, which shows a potential future for where we're going with Kotlin in like the medium term. And one of the subjects that's being talked about here is union types, not general union types, but specifically union types for errors. So
Well,
something
Java
that's
has that.
well, we kind of want to make sure that we have like an integration as well with, like, for
Yeah.
example, the all the operators we have in the language. and so on, right? Yeah. So I'm hoping that it won't just be the same. I am certain that we can find a more ergonomic solution than what checked exceptions are in Java at the moment. That's my
Yeah.
big hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think with looking at sealed hierarchies versus union types, my experience is that sealed hierarchies are a pretty marginal feature, and they have a slight value, whereas union types have a very significant value. Um, you have to know way too much up front with the sealed hierarchy, and it is very, very nice to be able to consume something and make your own rules for how it should be consumed, which essentially a union type allows you to do. With a sealed hierarchy, somebody needed to come up with those rules ahead of time.
Yeah. I think that's a fair criticism, and I mean, I'm hoping that we'll find a way to maybe also retrofit this into Kotlin somehow. We'll see what the future holds here. Um, Now one of the parts that, of course, I feel like we can't miss chatting about just briefly, is, of course, your actual experience writing Kotlin together with Spring. You already said that uh, you were kind of surprised by not being bitten by the language at any real points, but I'm just curious, like, how you felt the fit was overall between Kotlin as a language and then Spring as a framework.
I think the fit is virtually perfect these days because, I mean, Spring is, for many years, constructor injection has been the preferred way of using Spring. So that sits perfectly with the natural way to write things in Kotlin. I mean, I hardly ever use var. Everything, well, not everything, but the vast majority of things are immutable. I think the the Spring compiler plugin is actually really important because obviously there are some things you can do, like when classes need to be open by default. At first, I was a little kind of thinking, oh no, I'd rather write open myself. I want to be very explicit. But I have been converted to that being a good idea. Actually, Josh Long converted me on that. I shouldn't. He saw some open in my code, and he's like, "No, no, don't do it that way." And he was right. No, I've found it works very, very well. And also I think, frankly, if you look at Spring today, it's very concise. There is no duplication. XML has been gone for 10 or 15 years. It's very concise, and you say things once. When you work even with modern Java, particularly with constructors and the like, you say things more than once. So I would say that for Spring developers, if you want to see how good Spring really is, you should actually use Kotlin with Spring instead of Java, because you will discover that some of the rough edges are not Spring. They're Java. So I would say overall, look, Java 21 and above and Spring's pretty nice. I think it gets a bad rap that it doesn't really deserve. But again, as I said, if you have the choice of using Kotlin, I think it just makes sense because it looks very modern. There is no duplication. You say things once. I would say of the libraries I've used, well, obviously extension functions I mentioned with Jackson. I think that is very nice. That smooths that. I'm using Jackson fairly extensively, and that works just fine once you register the Kotlin. module. The one thing where I guess it doesn't look that elegant is JPA. I'm actually not one of the. I've never believed in the fashion or the idea that OI mapping is evil. I think actually OI mapping, if you know how to use it, is an incredibly powerful technology. And so, I think there's a whole lot of things where if you're using JPA and Hibernate today, it's much better than alternatives. But it looks fine in Kotlin. It looks probably better than it would in Java, but I don't know, it just doesn't feel. And I'm obviously that's not Kotlin's fault. It's just you're dealing with an API that's inherently based on mutability, and I mean it's an API where, quite honestly, well, I mean relational databases tables are mutable. So it is actually an API that is correctly representing a mutable resource. But that kind of, I have to say, my JPA with Kotlin just doesn't please me as much as other uses of Kotlin, but it does work fine. Also, the integration with Spring repositories, Spring data repositories, is lovely. I don't use optional anymore. I just use nullable, and that just works fine.
One of the things that you mentioned, so I didn't do a lot of Spring throughout my career myself, but I did touch it over the last couple of weeks a little bit, and of course, I mean, I was like, I'm gonna do it with Kotlin as well, and I was very surprised by uh how modern it really felt. Like it was a cohesive experience that felt like it worked extremely well together with Kotlin. That felt just yeah, it felt smooth. It felt modern. It didn't feel like all the things that you hear at like maybe a coffee point about someone who'd written like Spring maybe like 5-7 years ago. None of those things came to be, and I just felt extremely productive. One of the things that um, I'm curious is because obviously you have a different path than the average developer if you're saying we're doing Spring together with Kotlin, because again you have a little bit of experience with how Spring works. But I'm curious, how did you learn like the combination of like Spring together with Kotlin? Is that something you already mentioned Josh Long? Is this something where you just like you wrote again like a Java-esque code and then kind of moved it over to Kotlin? Or did you go through some examples written by some other colleagues, or how'd that go for you?
So, well, firstly, I had a Java application, a modern Java application built with modern Spring. So it was using all the current Spring best practices. Secondly, the Spring documentation is really pretty good regarding Kotlin. I mean, there's throughout the documentation, you will see examples where you can choose Kotlin versus Java. So it never really felt like Kotlin was. It felt like Kotlin was a choice that was fully supported. To me, honestly, there was no learning curve except the single thing I mentioned about the default open, which obviously also applies to some other frameworks like JPA, etc. That was the single learning curve. Besides that, I mean, I already knew Spring. It was learning Kotlin. There was absolutely no surprises in terms of the integration between those things. Because as I said, in modern Spring, I mean, you already use immutability. There's a whole bunch of things like, for example, I've got Spring configuration property sources that are injected data classes. Like if you look at a Kotlin language feature you want to use, the chances are it actually works fine with the relevant Spring functionality.
Excellent. I want to sneak in one more very quick topic here before we wrap up, which is that you gave an often cited talk back at Scala Days 2013, which was about Scala in 2018. So it was like a vision of where Scala needs to be in 5 years, so that it gets widely adopted and that it stabilizes and on topics like that. And we are now approaching the point where Kotlin is almost in the same position of being like 10 years after its original stable release, soon-ish. And I'm wondering, I know that you only like have brief experience in Kotlin compared to what you must have had with Scala at the time, but I'm wondering if you perhaps already have some thoughts on where you would like to see Kotlin 5 years from now. Like what you expect the language to do in that time, maybe.
That's a really interesting question, and it is, I must admit, something that I haven't really thought about. Because, I mean, some of the vision, well, frankly, much of the vision of 2013 or 2018 in 2013 around Scala was directly related to things that I perceived as impediments in Scala adoption and impediments in people benefiting from Scala, like the pain of binary incompatibility, those kind of things. So, a lot of that came from present pain. So, a lot of the vision was like, you need to fix these things. So, I don't feel great pain with Kotlin. So, it would be a pretty different question. I would say what I would like to see is, I think, continue to embrace the Java ecosystem when running on the JVM. I do know that Kotlin has a broader scope, but the JVM, as you said, is really very important. So I think that is a massive strength. The fact that you can use Spring, you can use Jackson, you can use JPA, and they all work well. I think continue to lean into that. I would probably, and I know it could be somewhat difficult in terms of compatibility, but I think some of the basic type algebra would be really nice. So union types, partials are really useful. Um, they are probably the two big ones, partials and yeah. So I don't think that it's necessary to go overboard with type algebra. Like I have seen in TypeScript, some people write code that's like just, I think, way too complicated. But I think really doing a good job on some of those basic things would be really nice. Also, as I said, object literals. I think there could be room for a simpler syntax there. That to me does feel like the one part of the language that's just, I don't know. It's to me, and I know this is subjective, but to me, every time I write an object literal, I have to remember, is this right? And that to me is not a sign that, like, I don't have to do that with many other things at all in Kotlin. Also, pattern matching. I do think that, I mean, after all, pattern matching is an area where, well, we actually mentioned the exception case. It's an area where Java is actually ahead and is possibly pulling further ahead at the moment. So I think that would definitely be a nice thing to have.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think that's a great reminder for continuing to embrace the Java ecosystem. I think we will definitely take that to heart as we have all this time. And those are very good notes on language features as well. I think on pattern matching, we need to give a quick shout out to a recent live stream we've done with one of our language designers, which was titled "But Java Has Pattern Matching." Which talks a lot about how Kotlin addresses the same problems that you can solve in Java with pattern matching, how it addresses them now, and how we are going to address some specific cases in the near future with some upcoming improvements in that area.
Another thing that I really do think is important, and I'm sure that you will continue, is it does have this pragmatic, practical kind of flavor in the community. There's not like, with Scala, there were a ton of people who came from the Haskell community, and, they never saw anything that they didn't want to make a monad. This is not something that is an issue in the community, and I think that's great, and long may it last. Where, it also doesn't seem like a language where people in the community pride themselves on doing the cleverest thing that may not be understandable. And I think that's extremely healthy. So-
I think that's a great point to end our discussion on here. Um, Before we say goodbye, though, you've I think alluded a couple of times to the fact that you are now building something with Spring AI and some machine learning stuff and so on. Do you want to share a little bit with the community what it is that you're working on, if that's already public?
It's not really public, but I'm happy to talk about what I'm interested in. It's basically knowledge graphs and retrieval augmented generation. So there's obviously a lot of work going on with respect to RAG, and there are severe limitations around traditional vector search and trying to extract knowledge graphs from both structured and unstructured content potentially provides a superior alternative to RAG. This is very interesting to me because, well, firstly, I think explainability is incredibly important in real world AI applications. It's not good enough to say, well, somewhere in those 175 billion parameters, there was a combination of weights that produced this answer. Fine tuning is just not the answer to a large number of problems around real use of LLMs. So I think bringing structure to RAG is a fascinating problem. And I also was an early investor and chair for a number of years at Neo Technology. I've always been a really big fan of graph databases and knowledge graphs. So, I think that's a really important area. One other thing that I can't resist saying at this point is people shouldn't feel they need to use Python to do Gen AI. So I literally switched, and I mean, I am completely fluent in modern Python. I literally switched from Python, in which at the time I was completely fluent, to Java and Spring AI and Spring. And at that point, I was far more fluent, believe it or not, in Python than Java. At least I hadn't written Java for a number of years. And I was instantly more productive for what I wanted to do. And now that I'm using Kotlin, I'm more productive again. So, there's obviously anybody who's interested in Gen AI has to know Python, right? I mean, I would basically say any developer on the planet, if they're serious about their career, they have to be able to at least read Python fluently and preferably write Python. It's just a fact. But if they are building the kind of applications that people typically build on the JVM, working for the kind of organizations that use the JVM, it is almost certainly not the right answer to switch to Python because Spring AI is really coming on very, very well. You can use the technologies you're familiar with. You can integrate with the libraries and backend services you already use, and your Gen AI works just fine from the JVM.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much, Rod, for sharing all of this. And of course, thank you to everybody who decided to tune in to today's episode of Talking Kotlin. I've learned a lot. I'm very excited to get back and, write a little bit more Kotlin plus Spring and maybe even give Spring AI a try. So I already know what my what my afternoon is gonna consist of.
Well, I've
So
got a few
yeah.
talks coming up using Spring AI, and they are all going to be using Kotlin. Yeah.
Oh, very, very cool. So we'll make sure to keep an eye out on those as well. So that's awesome. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining us today. Thanks again, Rod, and of course, we'll hope that we'll see all of you in a future episode. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.